Welcome to our virtual program. I am Liz Goodrich, part of the Deschutes Public Library's programming team. And during these crazy COVID times, we've been working really hard to keep engagement up with our library customers. And we do that by recording these kinds of programs and making them available on our YouTube channel. So if you are ever looking for something to do, to learn something new, please check out Deschutes Public Library's YouTube channel. There's all kinds of great stuff, cooking classes, history programs, pickleball tutorials, a program about Bigfoot that's currently got like 45,000 views. Bigfoot's popular. Anyway, we're really pleased that you're here tonight. And I would also like to introduce tonight's presenter. This is Murray Godfrey. He is a history professor at Central Oregon Community College, where he's worked since 2012. He received a Master's of Arts degree in history from Texas State University, specializing in the history of 17th and 18th century North America. Prior to coming to Central Oregon, he previously taught at Austin Community College in Austin, Texas, and Alamo Community College District in San Antonio, Texas. And Murray's been a great partner over the years. I can't remember how long ago we started having you come in and do
2015.
Oh,
so
wow.
I have my old presentations. So
awesome. So I'm going to turn it over to Murray now. Just FYI, you can use, if you have technical difficulties, you can put those questions in the chat and I will get those and try to help you. If you have a question for Murray, put those in the Q&A and we will be answering all Q&A questions at the end of the presentation. So why don't you go ahead and share your screen.
So I want to thank everybody for attending. So this will be kind of a brief overview of slavery's development and kind of the origins of the American version of slavery, the North American version, meaning that part of the Atlantic world economy that involved the trafficking people. So and how that related to racism as it developed in the North American context. So this comes from a variety of sources, including kind of what I've taught for a number of years. There's been a lot of interesting developments in this field recently. And I'll touch on a couple of them. So slavery as an institution or as an idea existed almost as long as human civilization existed, going back thousands of years. But there were a couple differences that occurred in the early modern period as the world became more capitalist. And so the origins of the kind of slavery that impacted the Americas started in the 1400s. And the impetus for this was the attempt to increase trade routes and for Europeans and to get around the lock-on trade that the Ottoman Empire had, in particular in the 15th century, which this map doesn't show up. The Ottoman Empire was based out of Turkey here and controlled much of the Mediterranean trade. And so goods were very expensive for Europeans. And they were trying to figure out a way to get them cheaper, and their traders were trying to figure out a way to make money. And what they discovered in the 1400s, in part because of the patronage of one of the princes of Portugal, a guy named Henry the Navigator. His nickname was the Navigator because he was a patron of geographic exploration among Portuguese mariners. It gave them a lot of money to explore outwards, more than most other Europeans were doing at the time, or European nobility. What these traders started doing was pushing further and further south along the African coast in the 1400s. And what they discovered was, well, they already knew what the kingdoms that were there. There were kingdoms that had been powerful since the Middle Ages in different parts of Africa, and those kingdoms engaged in kind of a quasi-slave trade. kind of the rudimentary early versions of what we'd come to know as the Atlantic slave trade, going in between different parts of Africa and to and from Egypt and the Middle East and so forth. This older world slavery worked different than what we think of as newer world slavery. And it was because of the lack of capitalist input. And that was what the Europeans really brought to the table, was more of an entrepreneurial mindset to it. So old world slavery, going back to the ancient world times, tended not to be based on race. Slaves came from wherever you could get them. The word slave comes from the word Slav, and so Eastern Europe used to be a source of slaves. So where you got slaves happened to be wherever you conquered, usually. Wherever a richer and more powerful country conquered a poorer and less powerful group of people, ethnicity, whatever. So slavery was not racialized as much. It was also not quite as all-encompassing. So the big difference that we see starting in the 1400s and continuing through 15, 16, 17, 1800s was the all-encompassing, for lack of a better term, life change that slavery would, that Atlantic world slavery did to people. Old world slavery, in a lot of ways, wouldn't look terribly different from different types of servitude and different types of peonage or peasantry. So the idea that their labor was unfree, that was a pretty common idea throughout the world in the early modern period. There were different ways to exit slavery. If your people were slaves, it wasn't a guarantee that your future generations would be slaves. It would depend on who defeated whom in wars, or what kind of societal changes happened over time. And the different kinds of working classes, a lot of times the work wouldn't seem that different between the slaves and the poorest classes in various parts of the world. Europe had moved away from using slavery per se for about 300-400 years. And they had moved towards the manorial system and a different kind of economy that used various types of peasantry. And there were similarities between that and slavery. So the idea that you would purchase people for unfree labor, that was not outside the realm of conceivability, outside the realm of thought for Europeans at this time. So there was already an African slave trade going on. And what the Portuguese discovered is that one of the more lucrative products that they could trade in was slaves. And one of the, as this quote shows, one of the earliest traders that Henry the Navigator sponsored said, how fair a thing it would be to come to this land for a cargo of such petty merchandise. We're to meet with the good luck to bring the first captives before the face of our prince. And so what they were searching for were goods that they could buy low and sell high. And slaves were one of those goods. And they were proud of having found this market. And this was just one of the many things they thought that they could acquire from the various African kingdoms. Most of these African kingdoms were more powerful than Portugal. Portugal was a small country. And it didn't have that many people. That was the reason why it was looking to the sea to develop its economics, because it didn't have enough labor in its country to really grow its economy all that well. And it made relationships with various coastal peoples on the coast of Africa. They'd typically, the most popular way to ingratiate themselves with coastal African peoples was to trade weapons with them. And in return for weapons, the the coastal peoples would trade in all kinds of goods. The most valuable ones were precious metals like gold, things like ivory, and slaves was one of the more valuable commodities. But there were various agricultural goods, fabrics, and so forth that the Africans traded in that the Portuguese wanted. So the Portuguese discovered very quickly they could not colonize Africa. They would die like crazy if they did that. Because of they were unused to the various pathogens and everything that existed there. So they did try to create a couple colonies, and they failed badly. Where they did have some success, and then the Spanish after them were in some of these Atlantic islands like Madeira and Canary Islands, where they discovered native peoples and kind of what happened to Native Americans in the New World. It happened first in these places. They had basically gave them a choice of, hey, start working for us or face the consequences, and then disease hit them. And those natives on those islands were depopulated very quickly. And then they started looking for labor from elsewhere. And what they developed on those islands successfully were sugar plantations. So the Portuguese kind of set the stage for European entrepreneurial activity with regard to the slave trade in the 1400s. But it was still a relatively small player compared to what the Africans were already trading with the Mamluk Empire here and different parts of the Middle East and so forth. The trade took some time to develop. The Portuguese developed it over the better part of a century and a half after that. So still 1400s, 1500s, still relatively small scale trading networks, but they grew bigger and bigger, and there were incentives to do more and more over time. But we think of the Europeans as kind of going in and having these and capturing slaves themselves. They did not, generally speaking. Sometimes there would be certain European soldiers of fortune that would engage in the actual capture of slaves, or of people to be slaves, but not too often. Those it was dangerous, and they didn't know the territory. They would usually pay locals to do that for them. And they did so in exchange for all kinds of goods. So over the next century and a half, when the New World was discovered, it opened up an enormous amount of opportunity for the Europeans to grow their economies. The opportunity they had been looking for the past couple hundred years to try to get access to the Asian markets, and get the goods there less expensively, and be able to trade with those, and do an end around of the Ottoman Empire here, the Grey, that dominated Mediterranean trade. So Spain and Portugal had developed these African outposts by the 1500s, and Spain had been the first to have a successful expedition, the Columbus expedition in the 1490s, make it to the New World and back, and started developing what we call the colonial empire. And this is something I want to stress, something I always tell my students. When you look at these maps, the maps are colonized. So and this is really bad, and something the textbooks really need to get their minds around. You see this green color here that shows what the Spanish New World Empire was in 1550. That is not everything they controlled. They had some control here in central Mexico. They had some control here in Peru. They had some outposts in Central America. Where they had more complete control was in the Caribbean islands. That was where they had successfully depopulated most of the natives, or unsuccessfully, if you want to put it that way, since it was not necessarily good for them to not have any workforce. And natives were in most control of this. The Europeans, it took them hundreds of years to really establish what we would consider those countries where they had sovereign control over the whole area that's colored in. it took a long time for the native populations for the power dynamics to shift. And so when we look at maps like this here that shows, oh, Spanish settlements, all the red, this is not what they actually controlled. They would color it in on the map, just like we do, and say they controlled it. They did not. But in some of these smaller islands, they did. So what became the most lucrative product out of this New World discovery after precious metals, which is what they originally hoped to find, and they found some, but then depleted that, inflated their own economies in the process. What became successful for them was sugar. And sugar was highly labor intensive. Spain and Portugal did not have the population to man these sugar plantations. They didn't even have the population to man the sugar plantations in the Canary or Madeira Islands, much larger islands like Hispaniola. So they needed labor. And they would get it from wherever they could. The initial thought was to use the natives as labor. And the Spanish sent over, and another thing we have to remember about the establishment of these colonies is who the Europeans sent were not diplomats. They were not scientists. They were not philosophers. They were mostly soldiers. They were people who were either former soldiers, veterans of various wars that were fought brutally back in Europe or in the Mediterranean, or they were soldiers of fortune who were basically pirates and people looking to get rich quick. So, I mean, Columbus was one of them. I mean, he was someone who went on, a veteran of the Portuguese expeditions along the coast of Africa, had gotten a charter from the King and Queen of Spain to try to establish a trade route to Asia. And his goal was to make money as quickly as possible. And so the way they thought they would do it first was, well, let's put the natives to work. And the thinking when Europeans first met the natives is that they were quote unquote savage and quote unquote heathen. And that's something we'll come back to in that the Europeans were not racist as we think about it in this initial period. That how we define racism today is not what they were. They defined their sense of hierarchy based mostly on religion. So, and on their perception of what religion was. When they encountered the natives, what they saw were people who, to their eyes, did not have a religion, and at best had some kind of devil worship. And so they thought, these, according to the Bible, we can enslave people like this. And so it was thought that they were first simple people that would gladly be enslaved. And then when they just didn't acquiesce to the kind of labor that the Europeans wanted the natives to do, they would fight back, and then the colonizers would try to forcibly put them to work in their colonial plantations, growing sugar. And if they would die in that process of either war and or overwork, they started importing labor from wherever they could get it. And the Europeans had done this to themselves. The process of conquering and taking over one place or another in their various wars, the process of being brutal towards others, and they had just gotten through things like the Inquisition, and so the process of torture to make someone do something you don't want or they don't want to do, that was not new to them. And again, these are soldiers who had just been through religious wars with the Moors, Muslims from northern Africa and southern Spain. So they were used to fighting these brutal conflicts and then dominating the people they conquered. And they considered it no different in the New World, and they considered it their right. Over time, Spain overextended itself and began to lose control of all of the colonies that it initially tried to establish, and different Europeans competed with them: French, Portuguese, Dutch, English, and so forth. Again, the most profitable crop was sugar, and after they depleted whatever the native products were, the goal was to create what they called a plantation. And this came from the name plantation comes from the English term that they used when they were colonizing Ireland. Idea is you basically place a new set of leaders over conquered peoples, and those conquered peoples become your serfs, your servants. And those conquered peoples are somehow lower than you in whatever way was most convenient. But usually that way, that means of condescension had to do with religion. They were not Catholic enough if you were Spanish, or not Protestant enough once the Protestant Revolution happened. That would be the justification for forcing these people to work. And Africa, increasingly, because of those trade outposts that had been established, became an increasing source of labor for these Caribbean plantations that were producing a very lucrative product, sugar. The most lucrative products that came out of it were obviously the refined sugar that you use in your food, was also used to preserve various foods back in Europe. And then the raw material that you use from heating up the cane could be made into rum, which sold very well, and various other products. So those were the most lucrative products they could sell. And sugar destroyed workers because of the heat involved. During the harvest season, it requires sometimes like 16, 18-hour days to harvest it at the right time, given the technology of the time. And it would just burn through workers. And the chance of a sugar worker surviving more than 3 years was pretty low. The average slave put to work on a sugar plantation lasted less than 3 years. So you needed constant replenishment of those workers, and that had to come from somewhere. To put it in the words of historian Eric Williams, the planters, quote, would have gone to the moon if necessary for labor. Africa was nearer than the moon, nearer to than the more populous countries of India and China. So they had a labor shortage. They needed labor. This was a way to get it. There were people providing it, and they were going to grow this system. And the capitalist input by the 17th and 18th centuries just got more and more intense, and they produced more sugar, produced more product, produced more everything. And to do all that, to take advantage of all that growth, you needed more labor. You're not going to do it otherwise. The English saw all that going on from the 1490s from the 1400s to the 1600s, and they wanted in on that too. But the English had a sense of their own nationalist superiority. They thought they were a lot better than the Spanish. The English and Spanish had been rivals for a long time, and the English thought they were fundamentally better people, especially after their Reformation, Protestant Reformation that had happened in the 1500s. They were especially suspicious and with a strong self-righteousness over the Spanish Catholics, the Papists, as they called them. Papist was a big insult that English would use against the various Catholic kingdoms, especially Spanish. So English people, the classes who could read, they were under, by the early 1600s, they were under a lot of influence of various propagandists who told them that the Spanish were evil and brutal, and that the New World, everywhere the Spanish Empire had grown, in the New World, there were native peoples waiting to be liberated. And so that was some of the original idea behind the English colonial goals, not only to compete economically, but to compete on a moral plane, to prove that their religion was better, to prove that their governmental system was better. And so there were some promoters that were highly influential with the Queen in the late 1500s, Queen Elizabeth. And two of them were Richard Hakluyt. There were actually two Richard Hakluyts. They were cousins with the same name. And Francis Drake, who was an adventurer, or for lack of a better term, pirate. So they were part of a group of colonial promoters that wanted England to compete more directly with the Spanish and Portuguese trade empires. England was poorer than a lot of Europe at the time, and the thinking was they could expand their economy by engaging in New World commerce, but they would do it better. And so in a very familiar idea, what they argued to the Queen, and then similar people argued to King James the First after Elizabeth died in the early 1600s in 1603. They made an argument that to us will sound very familiar. We'll be greeted as liberators. We will go to the New World. We will establish a colony. The natives will see how much better we are than the brutal papists. And they will want the gentle government, that was the phrase they used, of Englishmen. The thinking was they would show up, they would establish a beachhead or some kind of colony, and then the natives would realize how awesome these new people, these new white people were. They would prove that they were not the same kind of white people like the Spanish that brutalized them. And they would just start working for the English and giving them all the goods. And if you look at the original documents of the likes of Hakluyt, which they would present to the English government, royal government, it would be these pages with lists and lists and lists of products that the natives would provide. Basically, people like Drake would visit the coastline. They would take note of what plants and things were there, and note of what kind of economies the natives had. And they basically said, this is all the stuff they will give to us for free, or close to free. And so it was a very optimistic, kind of delusionally optimistic idea. And there were a couple of attempts in North Carolina, the Roanoke colonial ventures, which failed. Francis Drake was involved in that. And Hakluyt did not go himself. One of the Queen's favorite kind of quote unquote friends, Walter Raleigh, was also involved in that. And she didn't let him go, but he was involved in financing these expeditions. And they all failed. And the reason they failed is because the natives were not particularly convinced that that they should just give up their way of life, which was much more efficient than the way English economy worked. The English put a lot of focus on working hard, except the people who should work hard are the servants and like the lower orders. The more affluent and upper classes, like what these people came from, they were not the ones who did the hard work. They were the ones to collect the dividends from the work. So the natives were not interested in becoming subservient to these new colonizers. They didn't really cooperate, and those early colonial ventures fell apart in the 1580s and 90s, and they had to evacuate. They came back in 1607. This time placed their colony a little bit further north than originally, or than the original design. The thinking was the natives would be a little bit friendlier. There was still this kind of vain and naive optimism that the natives would just start working for English colonists. And so the kind of English colonists that created these colonies, again, they were not a cross section of English society. They were from kind of the aggressive sides of society. Many of them former veterans of the Irish Wars, in particular, the Wars of Irish Conquest. So they would treat the natives poorly, and demand a lot from them without giving them much in return. That would create tension with the natives, and eventually wars would break out with the natives, and then there'd be some kind of truce. And it was from these initial kind of tensions and conflicts the Pocahontas story came from, for example. And since she was someone who was a broker of diplomacy, and the goal was to make money. They weren't really making money, but the dream was still there for a couple decades. By the 1600s, they had changed tactics and turned to private investment to try to provide the startup capital. And the private investors kept being promised, you're going to get a flood of profit once the natives provide us the good stuff. But the natives didn't have a lifestyle that really produced an economy of excess. The natives produced the goods they needed. They didn't produce a ton of excess goods to trade for the purpose of trading. If the natives were going to trade, they traded for what they needed, not just to make profit. They didn't have quite the same concept of money. So that didn't quite work out. Wars and conflicts with the natives really kept that labor system from ever taking hold. Some of the colonizers attempted to recreate what the Portuguese had done in Africa, which was use some natives as agents to capture other natives for slavery. That worked to some extent in some of the colonies. In South Carolina, it worked for a little while, but not for terribly long, as the natives would pretty quickly figure out it was a bad deal. So, but the goal was still naively optimistic. When natives did not work out as labor sources, what they turned to was their own lower classes. So some of the arguments for creating colonies were to take pressure off of the problems in English society. England went through something that is also kind of familiar to us. There were a number of societal changes in the 1500s that made land extremely more expensive. And the economy kind of stagnated, and there was a lot of rise in prices of property, rise in prices of goods. And then there were more people than jobs. And the promoters like Hackett said, a place where we can deal with this excess population is the colonies. We can put them to work. They'll work with the natives, creating all these goods. And the goal was to use that kind of quasi-unfree labor to produce the stuff that would make England richer and put it in a competitive situation with the rest of Europe. That worked for a while. So lately, there's a big focus on the year 1619, which is when the first slaves showed up that we have record of in any of what became the 13 colonies, what became the United States. First slaves showed up in Virginia in 1619. According to the records, what they called 20 and odd Negroes were sold to the colonists in return for food by a Dutch ship that had been blown off course and needed to resupply its provisions. So some of their cargo were some leftovers from whatever slave trading that ship had been doing, and they sold them to these colonists. Slavery was somewhat more advanced and organized in the Caribbean and in the Spanish colonies. It wasn't really organized in Virginia. The Virginian Company up to this point only been around about 12, 13 years, they did not have any slave code or any laws that governed how this labor should be organized. And so what they did with these 20 some people was make them into indentured servants. That was the way that they knew how to organize labor, and that had been the goal of the promoters, and that was kind of the ideal that they were trying to create in this colony. Was this more what they thought of as a more moral labor system. And so that's what these initial Black people that were sold in 1619 became. We don't have record of how many of them survived for that long, but it wasn't that many. And really the labor force in Virginia was largely based on indentured servitude for the next 50 or so years. Even by 1700, the number of slaves in Virginia was relatively low. There were about 12, 15,000 Virginian colonists by 1700. Less than 1,000 of them were slaves. So most of them were servants or former servants. So the goal of the company and then the Royal Colony of Virginia after the company fell apart in 1624 was to create kind of an apprenticeship system that would deal with that excess population back in England and kind of put them into a merit system that would make them into useful, productive people. And the way you did that was have them sign an indenture contract. The company and the various promoters would propagandize the benefits of this. And they would entice mostly young English working class people who didn't really have steady jobs and who were crowding the cities and living in slums. And they actually had a name for these people. They were called sturdy beggars, what we would probably call homeless, that were living in and off on and off the streets, and sometimes working jobs, sometimes not. There weren't enough jobs for them. A big burgeoning explosion of young people, excess of them, and the thinking was this is something to do with them. And you'd sell them on these indenture contracts that would put them to work in the colonies. And so thousands of English young people signed up. Most of them were between the ages of about 16 and 26 that signed up for this. Mostly men, about 4 out of 5 men, some women though, about 1 out of 5. So thousands of them were sent to Virginia in the first 15, 20 years. And to give you a sense of how bad it was in Virginia, the company and then the Royal Colony sent something like 7,000 people in the first 20 or so years of settlement after 1607. And by the 1620s, only about 2,500 were in the population. So there was a very high death rate and also just quit rate. If you survived, a lot of times you wanted to get out of there pretty fast. But your chance of making it as a servant in Virginia because of the conditions was about 2 out of 5. About 3 out of 5 of them would die from various diseases and whatnot. The goal of it, you'd sign indenture. This would bond your labor to a master, whoever paid your indenture. And the way you got an indenture contracts, you purchased one from the company or purchased one from the colonial promoters. They cost typically about £6. And that generally funded the passage on whatever ship they went on. And then you got their labor for whatever the contract term said, which was typically 5 to 7 years. So then that labor during that 5 to 7 years was pretty much unfree. And if you looked at it, if we were to go back in time and view it, it would look just like slavery to us. The master had pretty much complete control over that servant. They could beat them, they could torture them, they could order them to do pretty much whatever they wanted. Pretty much the only thing you could not do was kill them. So otherwise, that servant was pretty much under your complete control if you were master and bought that contract for that 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, there was supposed to be a reciprocal exchange of land and some goods and some money in exchange for that 7 years of labor. And so that was the enticement that caused people to sign up for such a thing. The idea of getting land in England was unthinkable. But in Virginia, you could become a landowner this way. This worked for about 15 years until people figured out back in England the conditions were really bad and you weren't going to survive your indenture, most likely. Your chance was less than half of surviving it. So, and even if you did survive, you'd have been brutalized for those 7 years. The masters were not kind to their servants and they worked them extremely hard, especially once tobacco was discovered to be a lucrative crop. But still, servitude was seen as preferable to slavery. For one, it was just much cheaper. A slave would cost about 30 pounds. So we're talking, if a Virginia planter that was starting to make money off tobacco needed labor, his choice was servants or slaves. You could bring over a servant for 6 pounds each and didn't have to pay anything else after that for the next 7 years. And then there was an incentive to bring more population over, and that you'd get it was called the head right system, and you'd get 50 acres per head from the company or from the colony for every person you brought over, and you paid the 6 pounds for. So you're actually incentivized as the master to bring over as many people as possible. And then according to the contracts, what were called the freedom dues would come out of your pocket. So whatever acreage you was contracted to the laborer at the end of the 7 years, that was going to come out of your land. But the company would give you extra land in order to pay for that in exchange for bringing over the servants. But you're incentivized to get as much labor and then land as possible. So if you brought over however many servants, 20 servants, and you got 300 or 400 extra acres of land as a result of that, if you could see to it your servants died in 7 years, or most of them died, suddenly you're a much richer person. So the master, what were called the grandees, the early successful planters, the ones who got on the ground floor and got the best land, they started engaging in that kind of practice. So servants looked more lucrative than slaves for a pretty long time. A slave cost about 30 pounds each to buy it off the market, or buy them off the market coming from the Caribbean. The way the triangular trade worked, the North American coast was the last stop of any slave traders. So that was going to be the highest price for a slave. And even though you got that person's labor for life, if they weren't going to survive very long, then there's really not much financial benefit to getting a slave for 30 pounds versus getting a servant for 6 pounds. So most planters employed servants. And a slave code really didn't exist because it didn't need to. So as an example, one of the earlier kind of pioneers of Virginia was a Black man named Anthony Johnson. He came within the first 15 years, bought from a slave trading ship. But again, when he landed in Virginia, there was no legal way to classify what he was. And so he was legally classified as servant. He served out his 7 years and survived and got his 50 acres as part of his freedom dues. And he established a tobacco farm of his own by the 1630s. And he grew his farm. We know he was quite successful because he was in a couple different court cases that show up in the Virginia court records in the 1630s, 40s, and 50s, where he actually won some of his cases against some of his neighbors who tried to claim his land. And there's a quote from him in one of the cases. He says, "I know mine own land," and he actually won versus a white neighbor. So here was a Black man, came to Virginia as a slave and worked his way out of it, and which most of the servants, if they survived, would kind of work their way at least out of the worst situation. And he was more successful than most. By the 1650s, and then at the time of his death, the records show he had a plantation that was in the 300-acre range, which made him kind of one of the medium-sized plantation owners. So definitely on the more successful side of the society. And he owned a number of servants, including some white servants. So, and then he passed on his property to his children. That's when things started to get problematic, because the laws began to change in the 1640s and 50s. So it was his children had more trouble than white children would have had in Virginia to inherit his property. And they got into more kind of disputes with the Virginia government, and it became so difficult that they decided to move to Maryland as a result of the law, because the laws were getting just more negative towards Black people. The kind of things that changed were little laws at different times. A big change happened in the 1640s when judges in punishment for runaway servants, or in the punishment for running away, judges started to sentence those runaway servants with lifetime servitude. And they tended to do that to the Black servants more than the white. That was kind of the first change you started to see, which happened about 30, 40 years after Virginia settlement in the 1640s. But still, it was not universal. Black servants could still make their way into landowning status. Started to change more again in the 1660s as more slaves started to become populated in the colony. Then you started to see more restrictions, and it became harder for them to establish themselves as landowners. And so Johnson's descendants would have realized that decline in their legal status, which is why they moved. The last records we have of his family come from about the 1730s, when they were fighting to hold on to their land, when they probably lost it. We don't know exactly what happened to his whoever after his grandchildren. The last records we have is of his grandson, who was still a landowner in Maryland, but is struggling to win court cases now against people who are claiming his land, saying he doesn't legitimately own it. We think his kids may have gone to Delaware and New York, but we don't really know. So his life kind of spanned this what historians call the terrible transition of servitude turning into racial slavery, the labor force transitioning from servitude to slavery, from that optimistic kind of view of labor to a much more negative, coercive system. Not that servitude was nice, but there was a light at the end of that tunnel. There were various changes. One of them I mentioned was lifetime servitude. The other was classifying slaves according to what they called the condition of the mother. And some of the first laws were in the late 1660s that classified the difference between a servant and a slave was the condition of the mother, meaning if the mother was a slave, the child was a slave. That starts to make it more racialized. You can't really break out of it. By the 1670s, 80s, and 90s, you start to see slave codes become a little bit more sophisticated. In 1705, Virginia has more of what we would consider a fully fledged slave code. And people like Anthony Johnson wouldn't be able to exist anymore. A Black servant would be classified as slave based on being Black. There were reasons for that, and it kind of goes to the origins of racism. So as far as we can tell from the historical record, race as we think of it today, the hierarchy of what racism is, did not exist prior to about the 1500s. And we have great examples of it because people like Francis Drake, in order to make money, they would partner with whoever was available. And Francis Drake had a famous expedition against the Spanish in which he partnered with the Cimarrons, who were a group of former Spanish slaves who established their own colony in what's now Panama. He brought a bunch of those Cimarrons into his ship's company, and they attacked a bunch of Spanish settlements and looted a bunch of their goods. So, and from what we can tell of the records, they had a lot of fun doing it. They got along really well. So from what we can tell, there was not racism as we know it. The prejudice on the part of Europeans would have been based on religion and based on kind of the quality of life that they viewed against foreign people. So there was a rebellion in 1676 that really accelerated the terrible transition, called Bacon's Rebellion. And this was a class rebellion. A guy named Nathaniel Bacon, who was a lower level aristocrat from England, showed up in Virginia and saw that there was political opportunity among the former servants. The former servants were very conscious of not being treated well. The system of labor made the rich people richer and made it very hard for the poorer and the middle classes to really compete. And to give a sense of how the system, how it benefited the rich, it cost £6, and that was a pretty constant price to bring over a servant in most of the 17th century. So you paid £6 for 7 years of labor. It cost £30 for a lifetime. For buying a slave, a lifetime of labor. The way the Virginia government worked was basically by what was called the House of Burgesses, which was a Congress of essentially the rich people. And they manipulated the system to benefit themselves. The governor of Virginia created a system in which the profits he made from both taxes and from taking a share of all the tobacco and all the other cash crop goods that came out of Virginia made his annual income about £1,000 per year. So think about, you're a former servant, you cost £6 for 7 years of labor, and maybe even if you're a fairly successful tobacco planter, you're maybe making less than £50 a year and spending most of that back into the operation. That would have been something like a pretty good planter like Anthony Johnson was making. And here's the governor who's not doing anything but collecting all these dividends from the various products, which includes trade with the natives, which they had cornered that trade for themselves between the rich and the native tribes. They are making £1,000 a year. So, and using that money to buy more and more and more land to produce more goods and make more money and so forth. So the poorer classes got very angry. They joined Nathaniel Bacon in a rebellion, and a coalition of former servants and slaves and the poor in Virginia rose up against the wealthy class, burned Jamestown to the ground, and killed several hundred of the colonists and burned a number of their plantations. The colonists had to retreat to the seaboard and wait for reinforcements from England to push the rebellion back. Luckily for them, Bacon died of dysentery about 6 months into the rebellion. So, and Bacon had a series of demands which sounded very modern. He demanded more equitable taxation. He demanded kind of a distribution of land that was more equitable. He demanded voting rights for all adult males, which included all the adult males in his company, which were black and white, and fair ways of access to the ships for tobacco trade, that they wouldn't have to pay taxes to the wealthy landowners and so forth. A lot of what we consider pretty modern political innovations was what Bacon and his company demanded in their rebellion, and they almost succeeded. And that was very scary to the planters. And so what the planter class did after Bacon died and they reconsolidated control was develop more and more of the slave labor, which was easier for them to control because this was foreign labor. Give a sense of how much slave labor increased. Between 1680 and 1750, the estimated proportion of blacks in the Virginia population increased from 7% to 44%. and from 17% to 61% in South Carolina. To such an extent that a planter named William Byrd in 1776 said, quote, "They import so many Negroes hither that I fear this colony will become either confirmed or sometime or other confirmed by the name of New Guinea." In other words, this is becoming an African colony because we're outpopulated now. So the increase of slave labor became exponential after 1676 when this rebellion occurred, and historians have largely credited it with kind of the change in thinking among the planters of where their labor should come from. So why was it tolerated, and why did it become so powerful? Because English people were pretty big on their freedom. And during the Protestant Reformation, English theologian named John Pone said, "England is a body of free men, not of bondmen. No king or queen can give and sell them as slaves." Thomas Hobbes said that in order to have freedom, it is necessary for man's life to retain as a right to govern their own bodies, air, water, motion, and ways to go from place to place, and all these things without which a man cannot live. In other words, freedom is control of your own body. That's what they believed. In the 18th century, King George III, the people who the revolutionaries said was a tyrant and an enslaver, said that the pride and glory of Britain and the direct end of its constitution is liberty. So how did slavery become more powerful in that context? This was basically a genesis of what we call white supremacy. The class solidarity went away in Virginia after Bacon's rebellion, and the planters started focusing more on propagandizing to the lower classes, "You are better than them," and these are the reasons why. Maybe you don't today, and maybe you won't tomorrow, but someday you can own some property and pass that on to your children. Someday you can get married and have families. Someday you can associate freely and travel freely. Someday you can serve on juries and vote. Someday you'll be able to do all these things and be able to work your way up. Slaves can't do any of those things. So this is a way to create a racial solidarity versus that class solidarity that was threatening. So slavery grew as the economy grew throughout the 18th century. It became more and more powerful, more and more integral to the economy, and it accelerated with the triangular trade, which made America rich. By the time of the American Revolution, England is making a ton of money off this so-called triangular trade, in which the slave labor from Africa was fueling the raw material production, which was then fueling the industrial production back in England, which was all self-reinforcing and making the people who were able to control the different points of that trade, all of them very, very rich. To an extent, they became enslaved by the system. You became trapped in the system and couldn't get out of it. Even the people who did the enslaving were kind of enslaved by the system itself. Obviously, they knew how bad it was what they were doing. They could see it every day. So the people who worked on the slave ships, for example, they were in a way slaves themselves. Who would be the actual slave traders? English companies and moneyed interests would hire a manager, ship's captain, and he would hire a crew. A lot of that crew was conscripted from the jails. So you'd go to the jails in England, you'd conscript a lot of those men, 30 of them or whatever, and you'd say, "You're now the crew on my ship. And when you complete your term of service, your jail time will be done. So you have to serve here. And if you don't, you're going to go back to jail, and your sentence is going to be extended. So that's your choice." And the ship's captains were under the pay of these various companies, and they were also kind of invested themselves in acquiring the best, most profitable product available. And even some of them wrote about how they felt trapped by the system. One was a French slave trader named Jean Barbeau in the 18th century. And he talked about how, money is the god of mankind. I can't fight this. We spend the best time of our lives in Africa among Negroes scraping for money. This is what we have to do. And it was just kind of, he felt trapped by the system as well, but also was an agent of extreme brutality. The conditions were terrible, obviously, on these ships. So bad that some of the slaves would try to kill themselves. And a lot of the job of the crew was to try to keep the suicides to a minimum. Because the conditions were so bad, and there would maybe be 30 to 40 crew members that had to control about 300 captive slaves, people about to become slaves. And the only way you could do that was by an extreme system of fear. And so the whole thing kind of self-reinforced. And then they would sell the human product in the Caribbean, sell some of what was left in 13 colonies, and the system would spiral up from there. By the time of the American Revolution, there was a compromise with this system because it was so powerful. It was the bedrock of the economy of most of the 13 colonies, what were establishing themselves as the United States by 1776 to 83. And so the political leaders that politically founded the country, they understood that this was a system they had to tolerate. They did not, and they kind of took an attitude of, we know this is a problem and we hope it will resolve someday. They were very aware of the brutality of it. George Washington himself said in one of his documents that the way we rule Negroes is with extraordinary and arbitrary sway. So they very much understood what they were doing, and they also understood why. And so they compromised with the system in order to keep. They did what politicians do, and they compromised in order to get something done. And the something was to unite the 13 colonies in opposition to Britain to declare independence. They couldn't get all 13 without some compromise with the slave interest, which was actually most of the colonies, basically from Delaware south. It eventually started to decline north of Virginia. But they made this compromise, and they kind of hoped the system would just resolve. A lot of the so-called founding fathers believed that technology would resolve the slavery issue, that eventually technology would get better and they wouldn't need so many slaves, and you'd eventually send the currently enslaved people back to Africa. That was kind of the thought that a lot of them had. Some of them, of course, were deeply embedded in the slave system, made so much money on it, they wanted to expand it. And there were a few. John Jay would have been one of them, who didn't like slavery and wanted to somehow phase it out. But those people were in the minority, although they did exist. What they did not predict was how powerful cotton would become. And the way I characterize it with students is like cotton is kind of like oil. It's in everything. Look at what we're wearing. It's in your coffee filters. It's in your it's in pretty much every fabric you wear. It's in all kinds of products. It's still an extremely important product, and at this time it was even more so. It was integral to the economy, and then it became much more efficient with the cotton gin, and that just increased the slave labor to the point where cotton was so important by the mid 19th century to the American economy that the idea of getting rid of it was unthinkable. And the way cotton was produced for the world market was by slavery. And so the slaves and the cotton were intertwined. You could not separate them. And James Henry Hammond gave a famous speech in the 1850s called the King Cotton speech, in which he said, you cannot make war against cotton because cotton is king. And he meant king of the economy, which was kind of true. At that point, what we think of as racism became more salient. Southern defenders of slavery started using more and more what we would recognize as racist arguments to defend slavery. The racism became much more clear and more modern. The argument that slavery was just something to be tolerated went away, and the argument started to rise in the South that slavery was something that was good for Black people, that they were meant to be slaves, and this was good for them. And you started to see kind of pro-slave propaganda that usually showed the slaves being happy and that they wouldn't be happy being free. And a lot of criticism of abolitionism, which was growing by the mid-19th century. In reality, slavery was brutal. And I don't have time to go into the detail of how brutal it was, but it was brutal because of the system. And there's two ways I'll illustrate this. One is the value of it, and two is the way it could manifest. So the value of slavery was unbelievable. Approximately, because of its connection to cotton, it was part of a worldwide economic network that was a huge industry, approximately equivalent today if you were to do the net worth of everything that slaves produced and how that value was added. It would add up to approximately $11 trillion today. That would be approximately the valuation today of the global pharmaceutical industry. That's how powerful it was. Not just the slaves themselves, but everything related to the capital that was that they were at the base of producing. The slaves themselves were worth a lot. By the 19th century, an average slave sold in general for about $400 US dollars. In the South, keep in mind that per capita annual income in 1850 was approximately $150. People like doctors and lawyers made about $1,500. And so an average slave, not a particularly useful one, was about $400. A prime field hand would sell for about $800. That's the equivalent today of around $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 per slave. That's just to purchase one, not talking about what they produced. Based on planter records, what we can estimate is that the average return on investment of purchasing a slave, if you purchased a $400 to $800 slave, that slave over their lifetime returned for you, the buyer, approximately 10% return on investment per year. So if that were a stock, you'd be pretty rich pretty quick, especially the more slaves you accumulate. And especially if you get them creating the profitable products. So in proportional terms, in 1860, a prime field hand bought at around age 20 for $1,000 could be expected to produce about $120,000 worth of value in his lifetime. In our money, that would be like investing $100,000, and by the end of the investment, producing about $2.5 million. So, and there were approximately 3.5 million slaves by 1860. So not only that, but the social capital was also important. Having slaves was something that was a point of pride for Southerners, white Southerners. The brutality of the system, and I don't have time to go too much into it, so I'll keep this brief by explaining why people would do this and why they would tolerate the moral turpitude of it. If you were a white person invested in the slave system, I have students a lot of times ask me, why would anyone do this to other humans? And what I try to explain to them is, imagine the power over those human beings that slave owner has. Not only is it just this financial value, we have financial stocks, we have investments you can invest in today, but that they don't give you the same kind of power. They also give you social capital. Every slave you had was a product of social capital, that every extra one you had made you a bigger shot in the society that was connected to what slaves produced. Slave owners kind of looked at themselves like these lords of their manors, and considered themselves kind of the natural leaders. And your power over these humans was unbelievable. And you could do what you wanted with them, and you thought it was right that you did that. So it was an intoxicating system to be a part of if you were if you were one of the beneficiaries. The power is kind of unimaginable to us now because we don't have this kind of ability to control other humans this way. But it was about as close as you could get to being like a prince. And a lot of the slave owners actually did look at their estates as like these kingdoms over which these people were their subjects. So as an example of how brutal the system could be, though, because it was a system and it didn't matter how nice the masters were. A lot of them were nice people, but it didn't matter how nice they were because of the system. In 1850, a 14-year-old slave named Celia was purchased by a Missouri farmer named Robert Newsom. He was a respected farmer. He had 6 other slaves, all of them men. This was his 7th slave. His wife had recently died, and he had 2 daughters. And he told his daughters that he was purchasing this new slave, a 14-year-old girl, to be a domestic servant for him, to do his cooking and his cleaning and his whatnot. But what she really was going to be was his sex slave. And right after he purchased her, he raped her on the way back to his farm. He treated her like his mistress for the next 5 years, built her own slave quarter so they could have their private times. And between the ages of 14 and 19, she gave birth to 2 children as a result of that ongoing abuse and rape. When she was 19, she fell in love with another slave on a neighboring farm. And her boyfriend wanted her to stop seeing the slave, the master, Robert. This is something she didn't really have the power to do. She tried to tell Robert she didn't want to engage in sexual activity with him anymore, but he wasn't going to listen to that. I mean, she's a slave. She has to do what he says. So in June of 1855, they had increasing arguments, her and her master. And Newsom went to Celia's cabin. He made advances on her like he usually did, and she protested. And what happened was they got into a fight, and she hit him with a tree branch and killed him. There was an investigation of the murder by the police. This was by the 1850s, where abolitionists had become prominent. And so some abolitionist lawyers picked up on this case, and they wanted to try to make a point. And the judge that picked up on the case also wanted to make a point. Her lawyer tried to argue that the right of women in Missouri to defend themselves against sexual assault was also her right as a female, and that she should be there should be a not guilty verdict for murder because she was defending herself. And according to Missouri law, women had the right to use deadly force to defend themselves against rape. Celia, though, could not testify on her own behalf because she was a slave. And so we couldn't get what her side of the story was. All we could get were the prosecution's witnesses of who were all Newsom's friends. So there was no way to prove that Newsom was trying to rape her. And then the judge ruled that in any case, it wouldn't have mattered if they could, because the defense was illegitimate. Legally speaking, a white person could not possibly rape a slave, is what the judge ruled. Slaves were property. Raping a slave was at worst trespassing on someone else's property. If you raped someone else's slave, you could not trespass against your own property. And so there was no such thing as rape of your own slave. Celia was found guilty of murder, and she was hanged in December of 1855 when she was 21 years old. So this is an example of how even if you tried to look at slavery in the best light possible, this kind of thing was thinkable, and it was what the system allowed and even encouraged. The abolitionists who funded her legal defense, I mean, they wanted to make a point about this, and that's why they did it. And so abolitionists kind of won the moral argument here, and they were winning by the 1860s. Racists tried to fight back in different ways to argue that no, they were wrong. And what we know of as racism kind of developed as a result of that fighting back, which is kind of a continuation of the old pro-slavery arguments that continued after slavery of why the races were different and needed to be separated. Racism then became scientific, and there were various backlashes to any kind of racial progress. Backlash to Reconstruction, or backlash to the Civil War and Reconstruction was Jim Crow and scientific racism. Backlash against civil rights were things like the Ku Klux Klan and white nationalism in the 20th century. And then we have kind of, if you've ever heard of critical race theory, this is a new version of the backlash. There's a theory that every time there's a civil rights progression forward, there's a step back when the backlash occurs. And this occurs again and again in history. We've seen it again and again. We see it from the very beginning when I illustrated that Anthony Johnson example of when people like that make some racial progress, there's a push back against it. So it really goes back to the colonial times, this pattern of racial progress and then a step back. And this happens again and again. And the whole critical race theory really today is really part of it. So that is kind of a brief overview of the arc of slavery. That doesn't even do it justice, but if you're interested, the library has a lot of these books where you can read more about it. It's really a quite I find the whole critical race theory stuff really fascinating because it's stuff that's been, the history of slavery has been studied considerably in American history, and actually the history is the source of what became the legal theory, critical race theory in the 1980s. Some of the books that did the original history of some of the tropes I just talked about, the narratives I just talked about, those are the sources that the critical theorists used. So historians have known about this for a long time, and we've been exploring the relationship of slavery to the societal institutional system ever since about the World War II period, especially since the Civil Rights period. But lately, it's both good and bad in that it's made historians more relevant, but also put them on the defense a little bit, in that suddenly the things they've been saying for about 30 or 40 years are suddenly now kind of controversial, which is interesting. So I recommend any of these books if you want. But thank you, and I guess we'll take some questions.
Yeah, interesting. Murray, will you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
So also, I would love to get that list of books, and we can put together a bibliography of those books. I'm pretty sure, 100% sure that the majority of those are in our collection.
Yeah.
So I was writing down some questions, and I don't see any coming in through the chat or the Q&A, but if you have some questions, please put those in there. I was really curious when you were talking about perhaps some of our founding fathers hoping that the institution of slavery would resolve because of technology improvements, when really technology brought about the cotton gin, which brought about more. It's super interesting that they were hoping for some resolution from technology and really just made it worse.
Yeah. Well, they had kind of this, it's interesting now, they had a lot of the same arguments that we have now. When I hear the arguments about the labor shortage now, it's actually quite similar to the arguments they made then about why we need slavery. And because they're like, well, no one wants to work. So where are we going to find the workers? This is a place we can find them. And these people are the ones meant to work. to do this kind of work, and who else is going to do it? And so they had these same kind of arguments really all through the late 17th and 18th centuries. We kind of we think of it as, slavery was this evil package that just showed up, and suddenly the evil package that could cause the kind of abuse that happened to Celia just was like that. But no, it developed over hundreds of years. And so the founding father generation, they were very aware of the paradox of how they were talking about liberty when they had slavery as an integral part of their economy.
Yeah, and as part of their own personal economy, right?
Right. And they were aware of that. Thomas Jefferson was probably one of the most open in writing about it. And he wanted to try to blame someone else. He put that part in the Declaration of Independence, try to blame the King of England, because he wanted to try to say someone else's fault, not ours, that this has been going on 150 years. But they knew it was a problem because they had the same arguments we do about race. They worded it in different ways, but where you saw kind of what we would call today the progressive argument was mostly from certain religious interests. Quakers in particular made a lot of what was kind of similar to progressive arguments today over about how races should be equal, and we should, we need to pay people back for the abuse they've endured, and things like that. And they made those kinds of arguments, and the people who were trying to forge this country were like, we don't have time for that. We've got a country we're trying to build, and if we do what you're saying, the country will fall apart. So, and we'll all go back to being British again. So what do you want? We're going to do the best we can here. And they did try to outlaw the slave trade, or the importation of slaves, but with the thinking that would actually hurt the system or make it less profitable, but that actually made it more profitable.
Right. And that was super, as I was listening to you talk about the economics of slavery, it was really uncomfortable for me to have to listen to people be reduced to, to be qualified as and quantified as money.
Yeah.
It's really hard to listen to. And also very interesting.
It was a market just like stocks.
Yep.
And you could speculate in like slave futures. You could speculate in the actual product themselves, like you would gold or silver. You could purchase slaves and then kind of hold them or rent them out. There were all kinds of ways you could make money off of it. There were some people who specialized in that. Frederick Douglass was a good example of someone who was able to escape slavery because he was eventually owned by someone who rented him out. And he was able to create that separation and able to get away a little bit easier because he wasn't controlled all the time. And so he had easier access to running away as a result of that relationship he had with one of his slave masters. And so it permeated all through the system, and the finance was really inextricable from it. And people just it was kind of like now, like people just, if we talk about climate change or whatever, or any kind of problem that's hard, people just didn't want to think about it. And you confront them with it, and the religious the religious fundamentalists would confront them with the morality, and they were just like, what do you want me to do? Nothing we can do. Sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll get better.
Yeah. And that's, I think that's what's really interesting about our heritage, our American, the founding of our country. And personally, me learning to hold these two things at the same time, like Thomas Jefferson writing some of the most beautiful words about liberty and freedom, also own slaves, it's complicated.
He struggled with it himself. He wrote a lot about it. And he actually talked about, because racism was a little bit different then than what it became when slavery was even bigger business. And so Jefferson wasn't racist in the same way as racist would be racist 50 years after he died, because he was also in love with a slave woman, Sally Hemings. I mean, she was related to his wife. She looked like his wife, just a little bit darker shade. And from all we can gather, he was kind of obsessed with her. And, he thought about that a lot. And he actually talked about it in some of his writings. He's like, that I actually think the Africans have bigger hearts than white people, but they're in this position and that's kind of where they're meant to be. And what can we do?
It's super well. I just so also my last question, I wanted to ask about Celia's story. How did that come to light, that story? And
it's a pretty high profile case. It was kind of like, George Floyd or something. It was a high profile case for both pro-slavery advocates, people. And so abolitionists were kind of like they were the flamethrowers of their time, and they were a growing political movement. They went from like 2% of Northern opinion to 5% to 10% by the 1850s. And they were very vocal, and they used a method they called moral suasion. And they thought, what we need to focus on is just the blatant evil of slavery, the ungodliness, brutality of it, which was something that some of the priests back in like hundreds of years before had same campaigns they had tried to do against slavery. The abolitionists were very religiously motivated as well, and they were part of kind of a lot of them were part of the religious movements going on at the time, so they were motivated. And they wanted to make an example out of this case, because they were like, this is exactly what we've been saying. The system's brutal. The Southerners have been saying things like slavery is not that bad. Black people like being slaves. They'd be worse off if they were in Africa, and things like that. And so the abolitionists were like, no, and here's an example. And so they made it a high profile case. The judge of the case also wanted to prove them wrong, because a lot of white Southerners found the abolitionists found their existence of their opinion just abominably vulgar. And they wanted to prove them wrong with a passion. And so the judge wanted to not only wanted to make an example of them, they wanted to make an example of Celia's case. And so that kind of clashed, and it became this kind of public relations viral moment in a way.
Interesting. Okay, so we do have a question, and I don't know if I'm going to ask it, and I don't know if you have any suggestions or any. So the question comes from Laura, and she wants to know, what are your recommendations for how we handle racism now?
Oh, God.
I know that might be a whole nother program, a whole nother presenter. Yeah.
There's a lot of resources out there. Under the general theme of anti-racism. And I think kind of taking the cue from the abolitionists, what the abolitionists did differently than some of the older critics of racism was not give in to the passive toleration and kind of give in to the despair of the strength of the system. The abolitionists said, what's right is right and what's wrong is wrong, and we're going to drive that train. And they were willing to make things very uncomfortable. They were willing to put their lives on the line in some cases, because there'd be mobs who would try to attack them for saying controversial things, like black people should be equal with white people. Like that was a controversial thing, and they would sometimes get attacked. And so I think it kind of takes that activist class to be willing to put their sometimes to put their safety on the line, and definitely put their reputation on the line to kind of fight back. Because if you don't really fight back, you become, like I said toward the beginning, enslaved by the system itself. You acquiesce to it, and it's so powerful that you just kind of give into it. And because you make the argument, well, I'm not directly responsible, why blame me? But you are kind of passively letting it happen. And so the abolitionists were like the anti-racists of their time. They're like, I'm going to be completely against this. I'm going to call it out wherever I see it. I'm going to call out you people as morally wrong. I don't care if you like it or not. But some of them suffered from that. During the civil rights era, same kind of thing happened. People had to put their lives on the line. So that's kind of what I would recommend is you kind of look into if you really want to push back on racism, it's you have to create the wave that pushes back against it and not just let that tide come in and just float with it.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise, this has gone a little bit long. Ray, awesome job. Murray, I love always getting that backstory on things that we think we know stuff about.
Someday I'll get it within an hour. I always say I'm going to, and it always comes in closer to an hour and 20.
But I appreciate your passion and really helping us understand, the roots of this stuff that we are, that we're dealing with now. We continue to muddle through. And what did you call that time of transition? What was it called? The terrible transition?
Terrible transition, yes.
Super interesting. I'd never heard that term before. And that shift was obviously really, I don't want to say dramatic, important in leading us to where, getting through the racism stuff that we're dealing with now. So super interesting. Okay, so everybody who was on the call tonight, let's see, we did get one little thank you from Laura. Thank you, Laura. Everybody who is here tonight is going to get an evaluation to fill out. And I want to thank Ray and I want to thank Murray. This was a lovely way to spend the Tuesday after Martin Luther King Day to try to understand some of the.
Thank you, Ray, for interpreting that whole time.
That's long. That was long. So please make sure to check out all the calendars. And I don't see that as an insult, Murray. I'm saying it's long for Ray. Because it was great. So do check out the Deschutes Public Library's web calendar to find out all the really cool programming that's coming up. Our series next month in February is No Comics. Murray's going to be back to talk about the history of comics in our American vision.
That'll be more fun.
That'll be more fun.
Or less, or less.
Oh, Ray, there's your
serious.
Yeah, so it's a really great series, all about comics and how those play out in our society. So I'm going to go ahead and end the program. Thank you both for being here so much. And thanks for everybody for sitting here with this important topic. We appreciate you.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.